Okay, well, I'm really sorry that I'm not able to be in attendance. And there's another reason why for that situation. But at any rate, it's still my pleasure to introduce to you Professor Matthew Light. He prefers the name Matt, as probably some of you have gathered. I suggested Matt to the program committee more than a year ago after I heard him speak to a university function that I attended. I can't remember what it was, later life learning or maybe the President's Circle or so on. Matt can't remember either, but at any rate, I do remember being very impressed by the fact he was an engaging speaker, by the fact that he actively researched his topic by being on site in the country, had a good knowledge of the language and politics on both sides of the conflict of which he spoke to us at that particular event. It was on the Ukraine-Russian war. The program committee wholeheartedly agreed on an invitation, but wisely decided to hold off on a formal invitation to the winter program to see how the conflict progressed well into the second year. When I finally received the go-ahead to approach him to speak in early February 2025 and received his agreement and tentative title, Ukraine, the Stakes for Canada, I responded, excellent title, and by February, either the US election in November or the politics in Canada or both could alter your viewpoints. Needless to say, with President Trump and the political uncertainty in Ottawa, what better time to hear the words of an expert on Ukraine and where Canada will be potentially positioned on Ukraine in the months and years ahead. Matt has provided us with an extensive biography that details his background and research interests. Thus, I'll only provide a summation of that biography. He is an associate professor at the Center for Criminology and Sociolegal Studies and Center for European and Eurasian Studies, University of Toronto. He received a Juris Doctor Law degree and doctorate in political science from Yale University. His research for his doctorate focused on comparative politics with a specialization in contemporary Russia. He was appointed assistant professor at the University of Toronto in 2008 and is a dual citizen of the United States by birth and Canada by naturalization. At the University of Toronto, he has taught and supervised doctoral studies on a range of security-related topics, including policing, organized crime and corruption, and private security. His many administrative capacities include undergraduate and graduate coordinator in the Center for Criminology and Sociolegal Studies, and active graduate coordinator at the Center for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies. He has been a visiting scholar at the Uppsala University, Sweden, 2017, and the Hebrew University, Jerusalem in 2024. He commands full professional proficiency in the Russian language and also basic working knowledge of French, German, and Spanish. His research over the years has concerned migration, control, law enforcement, and criminal justice on different states of the post-Soviet Union, in which he has spent considerable time on research trips. His doctoral dissertation and then book, Fragile Migration, writes, in 2016, analyzed the internal migration policies of regional governments in contemporary Russia that explored the nature of citizenship in the Russian state and the relationship between central and regional political elites. His recent ongoing research is devoted to different aspects of policing and public safety in several post-Soviet states, including the Republic of Georgia, Armenia, Estonia, and Ukraine. Together with colleagues from McGill and Toronto Metropolitan University, he leads a 5-year insight grant funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada to investigate the process of police reform and related aspects of public safety in Ukraine since 2014, including policing, decentralization, gun control, and civil defense. What better person to speak to us on Ukraine, the stakes for Canada, than Matthew Late, or Matt Late. Please welcome Matthew.
Hello, good afternoon. Thank you very much for that very gracious introduction, and it's wonderful to be here. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with such an informed audience. The invitation was very welcome, although it's in a way, as probably most people realize, we're now at around the 3-year anniversary of the beginning of the war, and it's a sad moment to be contemplating the issues we're discussing. And in fact, when I was preparing this talk, I went back and I found that the speech that I gave earlier, the presentation I gave earlier, was actually for the Wordsworth Alumni Association, which was quite at the beginning of the war in early 2022. And when I gave that talk, I focused a lot on the origins of Ukraine as a country and its history as a part of the Soviet Union and independent state. I think in part I was trying to rebut the widespread Russian narrative that gained a lot of currency in the international press, including here in Canada, that Ukraine is somehow artificial or undeserving of being independent. I believe that with the passage of time, many people have now become familiar with the gist of Ukraine's trajectory. I will be happy to say more about that if people would like. But I think what I'm going to focus on more is to think about where we are now as a result of the fact that the full-scale invasion of Ukraine is now approaching the end of its 3rd year and will soon be in its 4th year with no resolution in sight. The gist or the main argument I'm going to advance is that we are now already in a changed world, and that this war in a foreign country that until a few years ago was not very familiar to most Canadians has already reshaped the international system and the international environment in ways that are profoundly harmful for everyone in the world, but particularly for countries like Canada. So we're already in a, so to speak, post-Ukraine war world. In the last week or so, we've all been transfixed by the drama surrounding President Trump's efforts to integrate Canada into the US against its will or annex it, which have an eerie echo of President Putin's arguments in the run-up to the invasion of Ukraine, that Ukraine was not a real country and that Russia needed it to be secure or needed it to be complete. I think I'm going to suggest, it's very difficult to prove it counterfactual, but one of the things I'm going to suggest to you is that the fact that President Trump could and did make these outrageous claims, which rightly shocked and horrified people in this country, is an indirect result of the failure to defeat Russia and Ukraine in good time. So I think since I've already been given a very extensive introduction, I won't say much about my work in Ukraine, but I will just say a few words about it before I proceed. My background is in political science, as you heard, but my more recent work has mainly been on issues of public safety in the post-Soviet region. I actually began my current project before the current full-scale invasion, and we are interested, the group of colleagues that I'm working with are interested in how different policing institutions and aspects of public safety have evolved in Ukraine's democratic transition since 2013. We have a paper that's about to come out in Policing and Society that looks at debates about local policing in Ukraine. Of course, there's a sense in which all this work that was done before the beginning of the war has been overtaken by events, and we don't really know what the future holds for Ukraine. I hope it will continue to exist as a sovereign country. I trust that's the outcome, but clearly its future trajectory and that of all of the world will be very much shaped by the outcome of the war. So I think where I'm going to go next, and as I said, I'm very happy to take questions about the earlier history of Ukraine, but I think where I'm going to start with is what I understand to be the motivations of the Russian invasion. And then I'm going to proceed with what I see as the consequences of the failure so far to stop that invasion, to deal a decisive defeat to Putin's aggression against Ukraine. So I think there are different ways to approach the motivations of Russia for invading Ukraine, as well as the factors in the world around Ukraine that permitted that to happen. Different perspectives have been advanced on what exactly Russia is after. One is that it's in the nature of the kind of authoritarian regime that President Putin has constructed that he needs to constantly be achieving some kind of external success in order to uphold the legitimacy of his authoritarian rule. Particularly since around 2008, Russia's living standards have stagnated. It never really made a strong recovery from the financial crisis that began in that year. And the earlier justification that Putin advanced for his legitimacy was economic success, and that's no longer available. And that the Russian nationalistic orientation toward Ukraine, which, to be fair, Putin did not invent, furnished a kind of opportune way for Putin to assert that he was upholding Russia's honor in the world, or restoring it to its rightful place in Europe, or even to its rightful borders. I think there's a lot of merit to that argument. However, the other suggestions that have been put forward about what Russia's underlying motivations are also seem to have some merit. Another one is economic and financial. So as part of the narrative of Ukrainian incapacity that was widespread in Russian arguments, Ukraine is often depicted as sort of a failure. But the truth is that economically, it's actually a key country. It's one of the breadbaskets of the world, along with Canada and along with Russia itself. So an interesting point, part of the reason for the inflation that we've been experiencing is, of course, the COVID crisis and the supply chain disruptions it generated. But there's no doubt that the disruptions of the grain trade from Ukraine also contributed to the rising price of food, which we've experienced here in Canada, and was even more acute in parts of the global south that relied on grain exports from Russia and Ukraine. And certainly if Russia were to fully seize control of Ukraine's grain producing regions, that would be a huge win, and would essentially establish Russia as, if not a monopolist, at least the dominant player in the world grain supply. Ukraine also is the source of a number of important metals, as well as a region of important industries, many of which have admittedly been badly damaged or destroyed by the current war. So it's by no means a small prize, and if Russia were to control it, that would vastly expand the range of economic assets that are under the control of the Russian government. As an interesting counterpoint, it's also been suggested that part of what upsets Putin about Ukraine's drive to integrate into the European Union and perhaps NATO in the future, but specifically the EU in this case, is that comes with it a integration into European international banking systems, and it will fully sever Ukraine's financial system from that of Russia and make it no longer available to be used as a place for the storage of Putin and his regime's dirty assets. So there are a number of other arguments too. I think, one question is, what are Russia's intentions for Europe? And at the beginning of the war, a lot of people sort of assumed that this was really just about Ukraine, Russia's argument that it needed Ukraine and that it had been thwarted in Ukraine by the machinations of NATO, went widely unchallenged. As I'm going to suggest, I think it's become clear since then that Ukraine is not the end goal. Ukraine is just a station along the way, and what Russia really wants is to become the dominant power in Eastern Europe, and at least among the kingmakers of the whole European continent, and able to essentially, if not dictate policy, at least block policies it doesn't like. So these are all different suggestions that have been made. I think rather than trying to adjudicate among them, I would just simply put them all forward for you to think about. It's also worth mentioning that the democratic transition that's been taking place in Ukraine and its gradual rapprochement with the European Union are themselves threatening to Putin's regime, simply as an example of a post-Soviet country that has decisively embraced a liberal set of institutions and market economics that are not dominated by a few crony magnates. Clearly, Ukraine has a long way to go to meet the goals that it set for itself, but those goals are by their nature embarrassing to the Putin government because they suggest an unfortunate contrast with what the kind of political system that exists in Russia. So in the rest of the talk, I'm going to suggest some potential ramifications of this war. One of them I just mentioned, which is the stakes for the future of European security, and ultimately whether Eastern European countries are effectively independent or not. Another is the growing authoritarian concertation we see between Russia, China, and other countries in the world, notably Iran, and what that means to the rest of us. A third is the fate of democracy around the world, not just in Europe, but internationally. And finally, and reflected in the title of this talk, what all of this means, not just for the biggest players in the world, such as the EU and the United States, but for small and medium-sized countries like Canada. So before I get to all that, let's just think about or consider where we are as we approach the sad third anniversary of the beginning of the war. I think it could be said that in the simplest terms, the war is currently a stalemate, but perhaps the trajectory favors Russia. Certainly, Russia has failed to achieve its initial goals of a decisive early victory in Kiev, in Ukraine, involving the ouster of the Zelensky government and the capture of Kiev and the installation there of a pro-Russian regime. That didn't happen, and it was quite embarrassing for the Putin government and undoubtedly dented his authority both domestically and internationally. Russia has also suffered major human losses of hundreds of thousands. We don't know exactly how many dead and wounded. The number far exceeds any other war that Russia has been engaged in since World War II. And it has suffered some economic consequences, some of them involving the burden of the war itself. So the burden of having a large segment of the population taken away from productive activity and sent to the military, the burden of paying for the war effort, which has resulted in significant economic problems for Russia. And as a related matter, the loss of human capital associated with the flight of now an estimated 1 million Russian citizens who have left Russia since February 2022, many of them young professionals. I was recently, oddly enough, in some places where those people have gone. So I happened to be the last 6 months in both Israel and Georgia, the Republic of Georgia. These are both places where people who had education and did not want to connect their future with Russia have gone in recent years. So there are a number of ways in which one can say that Russia has suffered as a result of the war and not achieved its objectives. The next shoe to drop may even be financial. So it's been suggested that the Russian currency is in a lot of trouble. It's already fallen quite a lot against other major currencies, and it may, I'm not a financial expert, but it's only by keeping interest rates at a very punishingly high level that further depreciation of the ruble has been avoided. So we'll see where that goes. On the other hand, Ukraine's situation is also quite dire. I think there's no way around it. Its population losses are smaller, but harder to bear. A number of cities have been totally annihilated. The most dramatic of these is Mariupol, which was essentially razed to the ground like Rotterdam or Warsaw in World War II. And it has lost a whole generation of young people. Interestingly, unlike Russia, they come from all sectors of society. So these are also the future leaders of Ukraine, the future doctors and businessmen and engineers. And this is a very hard thing for any country to bear. And I was in Ukraine last summer for the second time since the war began, and I was quite struck by the change in mood. I think many people in Ukraine now feel that the war has really come home. It's even if they're not directly involved in it through their own family members, the pain of the war including through the ongoing bombardments of major cities, has really worn people down. It's also, I think you'd have to say that Russia is nothing if not resourceful. So who would have thought that there would be North Koreans fighting in a European conflict in 2025? Well, there now are, right? Russia has a lot of money. And even when it has trouble convincing its own population to serve in this war, as it apparently is, it can use that money to it's rather horrifying to consider, but essentially to pay this evil authoritarian regime in North Korea to send its own young men as cannon fodder. Ukraine is also politically in a difficult situation. It's been restrained by its Western backers all along from prosecuting the war effort in the most potentially effective way. So it was never really allowed to attack Russian infrastructure or targets with Western weapons. The Biden administration went to great lengths to prevent even European allies from allowing Ukraine to use their weapons. So it's not just that they didn't allow American weapons to be used to attack Russian targets. They also went all out to prevent Ukraine from using other countries' weapons. Perhaps for this reason, Ukrainians were maybe less upset than you might expect when Trump regained the White House. Not because they necessarily expect anything amazing from him. In fact, a lot of his policies are quite alarming for Ukraine. But nonetheless, Biden had become viewed as a figure who seemed to be much more concerned about preserving the relationship with Russia and preserving Russia as a great power than about actually restoring Ukraine to its pre-2022 borders, the ones that are recognized in international law. Ukraine is now facing, I think, greater internal political instability also. When I first visited after the war began in 2022, it was very rare to find anybody who would criticize Zelensky publicly. A lot of criticism is now being broached, and there's a sense in which that is very healthy. It's a democratic society. People should be able to criticize the president. But there's no doubt, I think the sort of decline in morale is palpable, the sense that a number of bad decisions have been made over the years. And there is an ongoing debate about, in particular, the future of conscription. This is a very painful subject. Ukraine has made a decision that it will send primarily men in their 20s and older, so into their 40s, into their 50s even, to the front lines in order to preserve the youngest cohort of people who are now in their late teens or early 20s. But as the war has gone on, the calls, including from Western allies such as the US, to expand conscription have increased. There are a lot of debates about how conscription has been conducted, whether it's been done in the most equitable way. It's clearly not free of different kinds of problems, including allegations of misconduct. And simply, this is a punishing, cruel loss for Ukrainian society to bear, and there's no end in sight. So in contrast, while there is some indication of war fatigue in Russia, as far as we can tell from surveys, that seem to suggest people will be happy for the war to end, Putin has managed to keep the burden of conscription away from Russia's elite. So if you are a middle-class person in Moscow, St. Petersburg, the chances that you will know anybody fighting in Ukraine are very low. And despite a lot of predictions that the Russian economy would collapse, it hasn't. Russia has been surprisingly resilient. I just suggested that there is a new looming threat of high inflation and a rapid depreciation of the currency. Clearly, that would be in Ukraine's interest if it could happen, but Russia has weathered, you'd have to say, many financial and economic problems more successfully than people thought. So I'm not sure we could count on the economy being a constraint on Russia's ability to prosecute the war anytime soon. Okay, so there's also now the factor of President Trump, who is unpredictable, to put it mildly. Earlier in his presidency or his post-presidency, it was suggested that he would be very hostile to Ukrainian interests. It's now less clear that this is the case, that he is sort of fully committed to throwing Ukraine under the bus, so to speak. But that remains a possibility. And even if it doesn't, exactly what might follow is unclear. So it's also been suggested that just as in the Middle East, Trump is very impatient for a settlement and might use his leverage with Ukraine to force it into some kind of armistice with Russia that would not be beneficial to Ukraine in the long run and would allow Russia to essentially rearm and attack Ukraine again potentially within a few years. All right, so this so far has essentially been an attempt to summarize where I think we are in the war. But what I'm going to focus on now, and sort of bracketing to some degree the future of the war and its trajectory until toward the end of my remarks, is to look at what does the world look like now, and not just Ukraine, right? What does the world look like now after 3 years of invasion, in which Russia has not been brought to heel, not been ejected from Ukraine, not been fully diplomatically isolated, not been economically ruined, right? None of the things that might have happened to Russia have actually happened. You could say that it hasn't been a brilliant success, and I would agree with you, but the fact is Russia is still fighting in Ukraine. Ukrainians are still dying, their cities are still being destroyed, and Ukraine is suffering mightily as a result. So let me begin with a counterfactual, which is, for those not in the social sciences, a way of making an argument or developing an argument about causation, which involves trying to imagine a different contemporary reality that would have come into being if a certain set of past events had occurred in a different manner. So let's try and do that for what the world will look like now if in late 2021 and early 2022, President Joe Biden had, for example, said that he would not allow any Ukrainian territory to be occupied by Russia and had rushed offensive weapons to Ukraine without any limitation, and given Ukraine every authority to use those weapons in any manner it saw fit. If he had perhaps marshaled other allies to seize Russian assets in the West, which total in the hundreds of billions of dollars and are currently frozen but are not in the possession of Ukraine and have not been decisively expropriated from Russia. So I am not a military expert, but having read quite a lot about this, I think it is likely that measures like that would have stopped Putin, would have defeated the invasion, or at least dramatically weakened his position. What would that have resulted in? Well, I think it would have shown that NATO, the US, and the West were not paper tigers, that they had teeth, that they could mobilize, that Russia was weaker than it looked. And this would have long-term ramifications for the deterrence of other future aggression, such as perhaps that of Hamas against Israel with the assistance of Iran, or perhaps in the near future, that of China against Taiwan. Democracy would have looked like a winner, and Putin's authoritarian regime would have looked like a loser. Those who are contemplating expanding their territory through illegal means and violating the UN Charter's prohibition against wars of aggression might well have been deterred, if not completely, at least partially. And of course, I don't want to lose sight of this. Many people who are now dead would still be alive, including many innocent Ukrainian civilians, as well as young men who've died in the war. Ukraine itself and many other countries in the region around it would probably be moving decisively into the Western orbit. Their democratic transition would be progressing. In short, I think it would have been a much better world than the world we're looking at now. So where are we actually? What has been the effect of the failure to defeat Russia and Ukraine? I think the first point that needs to be acknowledged is that European security, and not just in Ukraine, has been seriously compromised. I've done some research in the Baltic republics, particularly Estonia, and I think something that is very little recognized in North America is that countries in that region are now quite prepared to be invaded by Russia. And I'm not suggesting that in some kind of invaded in a metaphorical sense or to be disrupted. No, they're preparing to be invaded. I don't know whether that will happen or when it will happen, but it's no longer a remote contingency, but a possible future event that has some degree of likelihood in the next 5 to 10 years. If you go to Estonia, for that matter, Finland, even Sweden, you will see preparations being made to try to repel a Russian invasion. That's because if Russia succeeds in finishing off Ukraine, or even in reaching a kind of favorable conclusion to the war that results in gaining some control of Ukrainian territory, those countries have every reason to expect that they will be the next targets. Russia has made similar statements about their artificiality to those made about Ukraine. And of course, even if the probability is, say, only 10%, personally, I think it's larger, but let's just say it's something fairly small like that. This is a kind of risk that structures all your decisions as a government, right? If you think there is a significant chance that your country will be invaded in the near future, that calculation affects every policy decision that you're going to make. If you think I'm exaggerating, I suggest you read the recent remarks of the King of Sweden, who said that Sweden is, well, not exactly at war, also not at peace. This came after the rather disturbing incidents involving the cutting of undersea cables, probably by Russia and China in the Baltic, which again really failed to elicit much of a Western military response. This was sort of allowed to happen. I'm not an expert in internal Swedish politics. The King of Sweden is a constitutional monarch like King Charles. I think if he said this, he was probably asked to say it by the government of Sweden, right? So this is a way of getting people's attention. So this is a very alarming situation in Eastern Europe right now. Why do I think that this is related to Ukraine? After all, these countries have not been invaded and they're in NATO, right? Including, as a matter of fact, Sweden and Finland have now entered NATO, probably mainly as a result of their perception of the threat of a Russian invasion. When I make this kind of argument, I'm often asked the following or something like this. It's not NATO's job to protect Ukraine. NATO never said it would protect Ukraine. And NATO not protecting Ukraine from being invaded or repelling the Russian invasion does not mean it wouldn't do so if Poland or Lithuania or Finland were attacked. And while that's technically true, I think what it's missing is the big picture in a number of respects. So one of these is that the war in Ukraine and the failure to stop Russia are in some sense an indication of what might happen in the future and of NATO's willingness or ability to actually respond in an effective manner. So I don't know, the analogy that occurs to me is the airbag, the air safety, the airbags in our cars, right? You just sort of assume that they're going to work if you get in a collision. If you start to think that they're not going to work, maybe because they don't work in your friend's car and your friend in an accident and was injured or killed, then that's quite alarming. And these things that you never thought about before suddenly become a risk you have to factor in. Another point that I think is related to this is that any favorable outcome for Russia and Ukraine, which does not have to be the maximally favorable outcome of fully conquering Ukraine and ousting the government and installing a pro-Russian dictatorship, will strengthen Russia's position for future aggression. It will strengthen it politically, it will strengthen it diplomatically by suggesting that Russia can get away with this and that Europe and the US will accommodate it, or NATO, including Canada. And it will strengthen it militarily because Russia's forces will advance and will be closer to the borders of NATO countries. So I suppose one conclusion that policymakers should have taken but didn't was that although NATO has specific obligations to its members, as a matter not only of morality but as a matter of prudence, its obligations or its responsibilities are not limited to those strict legal obligations to protect its members against armed invasion. By allowing a situation in which Russia has perpetrated a highly successful act of aggression over a period of 3 years and continues to engage in a variety of forms of hybrid warfare, such as cutting undersea cables, NATO is indicating that it is weak, right? Or that it potentially can be, that it is not up for a confrontation with Russia. Where might this lead? Well, I'm going to suggest some possibilities. I don't have a crystal ball, but I think everything I'm going to suggest is within the realm of possibility based on things we've already seen. So one is a kind of fracturing of European politics involving, for example, the formation of either the splintering of NATO or the formation of a more, let's say, hawkish faction within NATO involving countries such as the Nordic states of Norway, Denmark, Finland, and Sweden, the Baltics, and possibly some other Central and Eastern European countries such as Poland that are most concerned about their safety. And they might begin acting together in concert outside of NATO structures. As an opposite corollary, we might see a kind of, which I think we already are seeing, a more peeling off of pro-Russia countries within the EU and NATO. So the current examples of these are Hungary and Slovakia. These two regimes are pursuing an openly pro-Russian policy. The current premier of Slovakia has essentially threatened Ukraine with a variety of diplomatic measures having to do with the ability to gain further assistance from the EU, where Slovakia is a member, if Ukraine does not abandon its plans to cut off the supply of Russian gas to Europe. So there are now countries, we're Canadians, we're members of NATO. There are now countries in NATO that are essentially Trojan horses for Russia, and that's already bad enough. But to the extent that Russia is successful or appears to not be defeated, not only will those countries become more entrenched in those positions, but who knows, others might follow. And I'm thinking particularly of countries that are what you might call in the broader European region, not current members of NATO or the EU, but countries that might be inclined to head in the direction of a Western affiliation. Two that have been in the news recently are Georgia and Armenia. These are both transitional democracies that have their own reasons for wariness of Russia. But I think it's quite clear, and I'm happy to say more about this if people would like to. I won't go into a lot of detail now, but in questions, people are free to follow up on this. I think it's quite clear that if Russia is allowed to maul Ukraine, they will not be in a position to assert their own autonomy and will have to reach a kind of accommodation with Russia that will result in the formation in the case of Armenia or the entrenchment in the case of Georgia of corrupt authoritarian regimes that are allied with Putin and his inner circle. Another broad set of consequences that I think we can already see in the world and may intensify in the future has to do with what you might call a kind of alliance, or at least a kind of higher level of concertation among major authoritarian regimes in Eurasia that we've seen in the past. So I'm thinking in particular of China, Russia, and Iran. These countries have always been on friendly terms in recent history, but since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, they have moved into what might be almost considered an alliance in all but name. So not only are they all in the BRICS, but they are cooperating in a military level that has long-term ramifications. So China is a major enabler of Russia's aggression. I think that's already well understood. I'm not sure whether people are aware that Iran is also supplying Ukraine with missiles that it has been using to attack Ukrainian cities. Pardon me, has been supplying Russia with missiles that have been used to attack Ukrainian cities. This is not good news for NATO or Canada, right? These are hostile regimes that are now have now seen that they can do more together than they could apart, and have now established mechanisms for long-term military and political cooperation. I think we can see some of the consequences of this already unfolding in the current wars in the Middle East. Russia was among the countries that failed to condemn the Hamas attack on Israel on October 7th, 2023. It's been suggested that Russia had advanced knowledge of that attack. Russia is, as a result of its dependence on Iran, now much more clearly backing Iran in its confrontations with both Israel and the United States. So this is another ramification of the Ukraine war in terms of Russia's own diplomatic policies relating to its own adversaries, to the adversaries of NATO. So I think, this is maybe not well understood, but I would argue that the war that's going on now involving Israel, Hamas, and Iran indirectly probably is at least an indirect result of the invasion of Ukraine. And the fact that Russia has now fully engaged itself on Iran's side against Israel, I think clearly is a result of the invasion of Ukraine. So Russia has now, in a way, kind of had to do that, but nonetheless, it's happened. And that has meant that the West and its allies are now dealing with a hostile alliance against them in multiple parts of the world. And it's not just this specific alliance. I think it's clear that these three countries have big plans, right? They would like to construct what they would call a more multipolar world, but I would call a more authoritarian, corrupt world. And to the extent that they are successful in defying Western governments and defying international law, they are becoming and will continue to become appealing as partners to other governments that, to some degree, share those goals, whether or not they particularly are interested in the invasion of Ukraine. An example that comes to mind is that of Brazil, which is also a member of BRICS and has been quite friendly of late with both Russia, China, and Iran. And of course, in the longer term, we could also see other ramifications of this in places like Taiwan, right? Which for all you or I know, could be subject to invasion by China in the next 2 or 3 years. I'll say more about that in a minute. So I don't want to end this on a negative note. I mean, I would like to suggest that there are things that the West could do, right? I'll come back to Canada in a few minutes, but I think there are things that could have been done in the past and could still be done that might turn this war around. One is simply seizing Russian property. Like Russia has assets worth hundreds of billions of dollars that are in the EU and the US and maybe Canada too. In my view, they should simply be expropriated and given to Ukraine. That would be not only a dramatic financial boost to Ukraine, which is running short of money, but would also be a very significant cost on Russia and would finally suggest that the West was very serious about defeating Russia. As a related matter, Western leaders, particularly those in the US, need to say what Biden never said in all his 4 years in office, which was part of what I think finally alienated a lot of people in Ukraine from his administration, which is simply that Ukraine must be restored to its 1991 borders that are recognized by international law, and Russia must be expelled from every inch of territory. If you followed his comments while he was president, he frequently talked about the need for negotiations and for putting Ukraine in a favorable position, but he never really said that Ukraine has to win the war, that it would be unacceptable to the US for Ukraine, for any other outcome to take place. Relating to that, of course, is to give Ukraine carte blanche to use all NATO weapons wherever it wishes in Russian territory. Interestingly, in the last few weeks, we've now been seeing some very dramatic explosions. I don't know if anyone's noticed this. It's been covered a bit in the press. Russia has succeeded in quite severely damaging Ukraine has succeeded in damaging Russia's oil refining capacity. And I'm kind of curious what weapons they've used to do that. So Ukraine has been developing its own military technology, including the use of drones, which have, I'm not a military expert, but I think this is the war where drones have really made a breakthrough. So it's possible that Ukraine is finding workarounds for the restrictions that have been placed on it by Western governments, but nonetheless, those restrictions are quite significant. I think if we don't do this, we're going to see further negative ramifications of the war. One of which we might call further, let's call it democratic backsliding. So I think this has already happened, and it's possibly linked to the return to power of Trump. Far right and authoritarian forces in the world have been strengthened by the non-defeat of Russia and Ukraine. They see Putin as an ally. He's made a very successful effort over the decades he's been in power to reach out to them and convince them that he's running the kind of government that they would approve of. And they also simply see him as a kind of role model, somebody who has owned the libs, so to speak, right? Somebody who's crushed the opponents that they also don't like and suggest that they could do the same thing. I don't know, and I can't say that Trump would not have been elected if Ukraine had decisively won the war in 2022. But I think there is a good chance that he would have been considerably less appealing to others in the Republican Party if his main ally had been defeated, right? That didn't happen. Clearly, Trump is part of this phenomenon, but we see similar kinds of far-right actors in places like France, right? There's a very good chance that a far-right president will be elected in the next presidential election, Le Pen. I'm less confident that we can see something exactly comparable in Canada, but there's no doubt that any strengthening of the authoritarian regime in Russia is greeted with enthusiasm by certain segments of the far right, including in this country. I think the other aspect of the world that's taking shape as a result of the failure to defeat Russia that's particularly significant for Canada is what you might call changed rules of the international game. It's not that the world was ever peaceful or that it was ever guided by justice, no, but I think the fact that Russia has been allowed to get away with mauling Ukraine, partially dismembering it, has served as a signal that this kind of conduct is possible in the post-World War II era. And I will also add here, I happen to be from the US. I lived through the Iraq War. We could talk about it, but I would suggest that possibly the invasion of Iraq also was part of the sort of process of weakening this taboo against aggression. But there's no doubt that the fact that Russia has occupied part of Ukraine strengthens the hand of those like China who might well wish to invade their neighbors. So I have talked to people in the Western militaries. I think there's a very good chance Taiwan will be invaded in the next, let's say, 5 years. And not only has it changed the rules of the game, it's to some extent suggested that the West is weakened, right, and can be defied. Where does all this leave Canada? Well, Canada's not a dwarf. You know, it was interesting to read some of the comments of Americans during the recent crisis over the proposed sweeping tariffs on Canadian imports. I think there's a tendency in the US to see Canada as some kind of shrimp, right? It's not. And it's a country of 40 million, the size of Spain or Poland. It's an important G7 country. It's very rich. It's full of resources. But it is true that it has a relatively small military. It doesn't have its own nuclear deterrent. And I feel pretty confident about saying that the fact that Trump feels safe in advocating that Canada should be annexed against its will, right? I think it's hard to imagine that if we go back to the counterfactual of Russia being defeated in Ukraine in 2022, it's hard to imagine that exact scenario playing out. I think that the Russia's egregious conduct and the fact that it seems to enjoy impunity for it maybe is a kind of threshold condition enabling people like Trump to say things like that and possibly act out on them. And while we're on the subject, I'm reading the same papers as you are. Probably many of you have also come to the conclusion that the fact that Trump did not ultimately impose this economic warfare, at least yet, doesn't mean we're out of the woods, right? Canada still has to deal with him for another 4 years. And Trump is somebody who knows how to bide his time. And I think he saw what I also saw, which was that the reaction in the US to the proposed economic warfare against Canada was mainly had to do, I don't know if you noticed this, it mainly had to do with the negative impacts on US businesses and consumers. So even people that you might have thought would sort of see the principal point here, like Senator Bernie Sanders, really had very little to say about sort of aggression, right? That this is aggression against a peaceful neighbor, right? Which you would have liked them to say. And I think this is a disturbing aspect of the world we live in. That once these taboos are broken, you see how few people actually stand up for them. And I think that's where we are now. I will, I'll just share with you some conversation we had at lunch. I was talking to one of you about a book by the Italian author Giorgio Bassani called The Garden of the Pinzicottini, which was about a wealthy Jewish family in 1930s Italy. And it's told from the perspective of a friend of the family who tells us at the beginning of the book that they all perished in the Holocaust. But the book itself does not actually concern those events. It concerns their life before that. And it's a very interesting novel for many reasons. But part of why it's been on my mind recently is I think it is an example of how difficult it is to imagine the worst case scenario, right? And you can't quite imagine the ultimate collapse of everything you value, or the annihilation of institutions that are important to you, right? These are things that are hard for any of us to grasp. And you can see the characters in this book trying to rationalize away the kind of deteriorating political situation they see around themselves in fascist Italy, and hoping that their own, in the case of this particular family, their own wealth will protect them or other factors will protect them. And I think the awful reality is that it's now a very unprotected world, and Canada is quite vulnerable. So, what can Canada do? We're not the United States, we're not the EU, we're not Britain, we're not France, we're not Germany, right? We're not by any means a midget, but we are a medium-sized country. I think some of the things that we can do still are things that should have been done earlier. I think the failure of the current government, and to be fair, previous governments, to sort of think seriously about Canada's defense needs and to provide for a more credible military. And I don't mean to in any way disparage the current military. Let me rephrase that. A larger military, have weakened us in a point where our own security is now endangered. Beyond that, I think if we look at Canada's response to Ukraine, it's not that Canada's said bad things, right, or done bad things. It's always been very clear that the war is unacceptable and outrageous, and that Ukraine should be supported, and it's done some things to support Ukraine. My reading, though, is that Canada has been happy to be part of the pro-Ukraine consensus within the West without necessarily playing a leading role. And I think the recent scare over the attempted economic destruction of Canadian industries should motivate us to advocate for a firmer line in favor of Ukraine. So not just support Ukraine, but to really drive Russia out of Ukraine. That's clearly in our own national interest. We can't control the US, but we can control what we do, the kinds of positions we take on our own or in concert with other allies. Canada has some cards to play. And as I alluded to, I think maybe the first step is simply to acknowledge the very frightening and dark reality of the international order that's come into place with the Russian aggression against Ukraine. I don't know that much about this period, but it would be interesting to look at how the leaders of the 1930s and 40s mobilized the Canadian population to face the challenges of that era. I think the continuity is here we are in North America. We have one neighbor, one land neighbor, and you can feel very insulated from the world around us. But I think we can all see that Canada is now facing a more turbulent reality that is affecting our own future as a country, is perhaps even our own day-to-day lives in a way that would have been hard to imagine before the current invasion of Ukraine. So that was quite a lot, and I'm happy to take questions and look forward to your thoughts.